Welcome back, grade 7 and 8. In our last video, we explored a little bit more about the eye, and we tried to understand not only what the eye was and how it focuses light by using refraction from our lens to try to focus those light rays coming in onto the back of our eye into a spot called the retina. But we also started to explore a little bit more about how not all of us have a perfect round shaped eye, but oftentimes some of us might have an eye that's a little bit longer than normal or a little bit shorter than normal. And so we might be what's called nearsighted or farsighted. And we might even need to use different lenses, whether that be glasses or contact lenses, something that does the same sort of thing but much closer to our eye. Or even some people might have laser eye surgery, which corrects or changes the curvature of our actual eye lens itself in order to be able to allow us to see things more clearly, in order to really allow those light rays to focus on the proper spot on the back of our eye onto the retina. But one of the ways that we can understand the eye a little bit more is by comparing it to a camera. And that's because there are many similarities between the human eye and the camera. We already know that we see objects when light from an object focuses on our retina as it travels and refracts through our lens. In a camera, particularly if we're talking about older cameras that deal with film as well, the lens refracts the light and the film senses the light. And so that's one way in which it's doing something very similar to our eyes. If we take a look here, both the camera and the eye both use a lens to be able to use that refraction. We have different muscles that allow us to do the focusing that we need to, whereas that's much more mechanical when it comes to a camera. And for both a camera and our eye, the image focuses on either the film or the retina in order to create an image that we're able to see. In a camera, if an object moves closer to the film, now we're talking older cameras here, the lens must move further away in order to keep the image in focus. Most cameras have what's called a focal distance. And even with some of our cameras that are built into our phones, if we get too close to an object, we might have a harder time seeing it, or it might have a harder time focusing on that particular object. And this is exactly what you do when you focus your camera. What you're really doing is you are adjusting how far away you are from it. In the human eye, though, you can't move the lens further away from the retina. Instead, we have something called the ciliary muscles, which help change the shape of our lens. If the object we're looking at comes closer to us, then these muscles have to make our lens bulge in the middle. Really, what it's doing is it's changing that curve of the lens, which is causing it to refract more or refract less. These keep the object in focus on the retina without having to stretch the eyeball. The process of changing the shape of the lens to adjust from different object distances is called accommodation. And God's designed us in such an awesome way in which this is done just naturally. It's not something we even have to put any thought to. It's something that just happens as a way of God's design of who we are and the way that we function. As people become older, though, that lens stiffens and loses the ability to change shape. It can no longer become thick enough to focus on closer objects, and as a result, many people, as they get older, might need to wear more convex lenses as reading glasses in order to help out with that. The shortest distance at which an object is in focus we call the near point of the eye, and the longest distance is the far point of the eye. For the average adult human eye, that near point is usually about 25 centimeters away. However, babies can focus on objects that are only about 7 centimeters away. The far point is said to be infinity for us. After all, a person with normal vision, if we just look up, we can see stars, and they may be thousands of light years away. If you're photographing a scene and a cloud suddenly covers the sun, the brightness of that scene decreases. As a result, the amount of light reaching our coming into our camera decreases as well. If the light is too dim, then we might not receive enough light to be able to take a picture of that image clearly. In this case, the camera's diaphragm and shutter, if we're talking about old school or much more fancier cameras, can be adjusted to allow the correct amount of light to reach it. The diaphragm is a device that controls the aperture, the opening of a lens or optical system. The shutter is a device that limits the passage of light. Now, for many of us where we are using digital cameras or we're using things that are a little more fancy, this might be done automatically for us. But for those of you who really want to get higher into photography, or you really want to get further into it, understanding more about aperture, understanding more about shutter and shutter speed is going to be very, very important in order to really capture pictures at their best. The aperture in a diaphragm can let more light into the camera by opening wider, which is what we see here. So we use a small aperture when we're trying to photograph bright scenes, and we might use a larger aperture as we open that up to photograph dimly lit scenes because we want to let more of that light to come in. Well, what's kind of cool is that by understanding that, understanding the way that a camera has to get either smaller or bigger to let more or less light in, we can also get another glimpse at something about the human eye. So, with the human eye, as we see here, it does the same sort of thing. The iris, which is that colored ring, focuses like the diaphragm of a camera. If the light is dim, the iris increases the size of the eye's opening to let in more light. This opening is called the pupil, which appears as the dark center of our eye. So the pupil and the iris kind of work as the diaphragm and the aperture opening in a camera. The natural adjustment in the size of the pupil is called the iris reflex. We are generally unaware of this reflex, which is extremely rapid. But think about what happens when you first walk into a dark movie theater on a bright sunny day. We are often unable to see anything at first. The split-second iris reflex is the first in a series of adjustments the eye makes to enable you to see the interior of that darker room. When you leave the theater and walk into a bright sunlight, the opposite reaction occurs. The daylight glare makes your eyes feel uncomfortable. However, the iris reflex quickly shrinks the size of your pupil, less light enters the eye, and other adjustments take place so that your eye feels comfortable again. You can actually see this taking place if you spend time in a really dark room. You look at a mirror and you flick the light on. And if you take a look at the center parts of your eye, you might actually start seeing them get larger or smaller again. If we're thinking back to film cameras, at the back of the camera is where you might find that film. And the image is focused onto this light sensitive material. The light energy causes chemical reactions to change the film to record the images. Well, in our human eye, the retina senses the light. When the cells in the retina detect light, they produce small electrical impulses that travel from the retina to the brain through what we call our optic nerve. So that's something that's really, really cool, is that all of this is taking place with photosensitive or light sensitive cells in the back of our eye, sending electrical signals to our brain for us to interpret what we're seeing. As we continue to explore more about the eye, um, the point where the optic nerve enters the retina, though, it does not have any light sensing cells. This point is known as the blind spot. And when we are thinking about kind of the blind spot um, for us, we can think about what can we see and what can't we see when we are covering up one eye and just looking at a particular object. Or if we take something and we put it far enough away from us and we cover up half of it, what can we see, what can't we see, what appears, what doesn't appear, what changes when we close one eye and open another, and when we swap that. The parts of a camera are all generally contained within a rigid light-proof box. We want to make sure that we can adjust the light coming in and that it's not coming in spots that we don't want it to. In the eyes, layers of tissue hold the different parts together. In order to keep the eye from collapsing, which is a scary thing to think about, the eyeball is filled with fluids called or humors. In addition to keeping the eye rigid, these humors help refract the light that enters the eye. And if we take a look, we see a different picture here where we have our different muscles. We have our lens, our iris, our pupils, our cornea. We have our retina and our optic nerve, but we also have our different types of humors in order to allow that refraction of light to be able to continue. God made our eyes wonderfully complex. And in doing so, we are learning more and more about them every single day. But by understanding a bit more about a camera, we get a better glimpse at how an eye works, and we should get a better appreciation for the creator behind it all as well.